prayers of your people. Be our strong defense against all harm and danger, that we may live and grow in faith and hope, through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.
Would anyone like to read Lamentations 3:22 to 33?
I will.
Okay, thank you,
The
Rachel.
steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says the soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for one to bear the yoke in youth, to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it, to put one's mouth to the dust, there may yet be hope, to give one's cheek to the smiter and be filled with insults. For the Lord will not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone.
Thank you.
The very first verse reminds me, well, the second one, reminds me of my favorite hymn.
Great is thy faithfulness. Yes, pulled right out of Lamentations. And that was kind of what I was going to say. 22 and 23 are, very beloved verses of the Bible. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. But we find that praise in the middle of a book about lament, don't we? So let's kind of talk about lament a little bit, because I think what we don't want to do is miss the point of the book, which is a book of lament written by the people of Jerusalem around 587 BCE.
What's the E?
Well, the current is before Common Era. So a lot of times it's now referred to as BCE and CE rather than BC and AD. Common Era is kind of the current way that people in academic settings refer to the before the time of Christ. And because if you think about it, AD, I've always taught that it was after death, but that doesn't begin at 33 AD. You know what I mean? It's so I think they've kind of updated that because it's not really reflective of. I mean, it does kind of center on when Christ was born, the before Common Era and Common Era.
So when does Common Era start? When Jesus is born?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They started doing that about 12 years ago. They decided to take church out of it a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But but in a way, in a good way, because again, if Christ died around the year 33, then it would make sense that between 0 and 33 is all called AD.
Yeah.
I think that so. So 587 BCE, the Babylonians, as we know, they smashed the walls of Jerusalem. They burnt down the temple. They knocked down the houses of the city, and the people went into exile. The people of Jerusalem went into exile in Babylon, and so this book was kind of written in this time of chaos and uncertainty and horrific circumstances that I don't think any of us can quite fathom. So it is a book of lament.
But it was the Babylonians who destroyed Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
and then they went into exile
in Babylon
because they were captured.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and the people of Jerusalem viewed that as possibly a punishment from God for making idols and not being faithful to God in a number of ways. And so this book is both like it's about finding hope in the steadfastness of a God who will not, as it says, where is it? The Lord will not reject forever. They believed that. They believed that God was not abandoning them, but they looked at this time in Babylon as sort of a punishment, like a refinement that they had to endure. And so, yeah, let's talk a little bit about suffering. And this passage specifically, it kind of says, although God causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. And then it says, he does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone. You almost have this kind of, this thought where they don't want to attribute every affliction to God, but yet they kind of do.
Yeah, kind of both ways.
Yeah, it's both kind of wanting to kind of allude that God did cause the destruction of the temple, or allowed the Babylonians to do that, allowed the Babylonians to take them into exile, but yet they don't want to blame God for what they feel is their own unfaithfulness that maybe led to all of that.
Well, doesn't that kind of relate to today when when God allows things to happen, and we always sit and wonder why? Why did God allow that to happen?
Right.
But, we don't know his purpose, but yet we wonder. We sit and we think, oh, that is so horrible. Why did God let that happen?
Didn't Pastor Bonnie say something about God doesn't allow it to happen? It just happens because of choices that people make?
Yeah, I would be hesitant to take an example of the Israelites in Jerusalem being exiled to Babylon. I would be hesitant to put that in today's context and say, what I'm saying is that God may have allowed the Babylonians to come in and destroy the temple, burn down the city, take the people captive. I don't know that I would say that God allows that kind of thing to happen today. I certainly wouldn't say that about Hurricane Katrina or 9/11 or a war or any kind of catastrophe that the tsunami in Indonesia. I wouldn't blame any of that. I wouldn't attribute that to God punishing people. So I want to.
No, I don't think of it as punishment. I just think of it as allowing it.
He allows it, he doesn't stop it.
Right.
Yeah, it didn't stop it.
And I think that's undeniable, that God obviously allows things to happen. There is sin and evil in the world, and sometimes that sin and evil causes very bad harm to innocent people. And God, we believe God could intervene, but God doesn't often work that way. And the book of Lamentations, I think, is meant to ask us to sit with that grief and that suffering and not to let it pass by too quickly. And that's something as humans, I think we want to kind of get on to the greatest thy faithfulness moment.
Well,
And instead of sitting with the lament and the grief and wondering, as you said, Rachel, why? Why God? I think I honestly believe that a lot of the witness of the Psalms and the Old Testament and the book of Lamentations is asking us to care about the suffering of others and to think about it and to sit with
Well,
it.
in verse 32, he says, although he causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love.
Right. That is a good example of the writer of Lamentations finding purpose, finding benefit in the suffering and adversity that his people faced. That even if he believed God imposed it, he still found it to be beneficial, as if God was refining them like in a fire. So,
Well, we mentioned earlier that the church put in a new family bathroom so that when someone wheels her husband in with a wheelchair to church, she doesn't have to wait till after the church for him to go to the bathroom.
right.
So, they don't have to suffer anymore. The church has figured out that some people would suffer, and so they're fixing the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Suffering, I think about suffering in a lot of different ways. The way that I find peace and solace in the suffering that God seems to allow on earth, I always go back to Jesus. We have God incarnated as a human being, and his life was one of poverty and suffering, and his death, I can't think of a more horrific death
Oh, I can't.
that a human being would die. And that was God being crucified. And if we can find any model in that, any moral value in that, it's that God, even God, is not immune to the evil and the suffering of the world, the pain and the evil meaning the people who unjustly killed Jesus. Even God was not immune to it. God comes into it and brings healing out of that death and out of that evil. But God is not, like in a bubble, protected against it, if that makes sense.
I think a lot of people don't believe in God because he doesn't stop the bad things from happening.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
I mean, and you got to remember, we do have a devil here too.
We do live in a world with evil. That is undeniable. You can't go a day without finding some example in the news of people acting on selfish desire and evil intent and taking innocent lives.
Isn't it kind of a contradiction in verse 33 when it says in 32 it says he causes grief, then 33 he does not willingly afflict.
Exactly, and that's the word I couldn't come up with, contradiction, a minute ago. Yes, the writer seems to have trouble determining, does God cause the grief, but in his compassion he's also faithful, but yet he doesn't willingly afflict or grieve anyone. It's a contradicting thought. And at times I wonder if that's more on the human writer than on God, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It does.
But I think we find a lot of hope in Lamentations too. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord, to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it. I think, one takeaway I get is that it is good at times to feel the loving correction of God. I don't want to say punishment, but the loving correcting hand of God upon us. There are times that I've felt humbled in life, and I attribute that to God maybe humbling me, and I think I'm to glean that I need to take a step back and think about what I've done or how I acted, and so when I read, it is good for one to bear the yoke in youth, to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it. I resonate with that. I think, there are times I need to be humbled and to sit and think about how faithfully or not I'm living.
And isn't that kind of when he gives us a choice? We either follow him or we don't.
Right. Yes, I think part of being a follower of God is to be aware of what the Spirit of God might be doing in our lives and telling us. I mean, it's not an audible voice, but I do think if we attempt to talk to God daily and be in tune with God, that we will find little nudges and proddings and signs that kind of inform how we ought to live. And I mean, again, it's mysterious in many ways. I don't think that, I don't pull up to a stoplight and I'm like, do I go left? Do I go right, God? We're not puppets, you know, but when big life decisions need to be made, or when someone we know becomes ill, when we face illness, I do think there are times that we go to God in prayer and what do I do now? And I do, and we may get no answer. And for the people of Lamentations, the answer did not come immediately. They were in exile a long time. But I do think if we are in tune with God, that we will feel some leading in life. It may not always be obvious, but...
What is the area of Babylon? What is it called today?
I would have to look that up. It would be in the Middle East. It would be east of Jerusalem in Galilee. It would be, I don't know how many miles. It might be 200 to 300 miles east. So would that be modern day Iraq or
Syria. Probably.
Syria?
Possibly.
Yeah. So.
But a moral dilemma that I've always had is, so if God is all-powerful, why doesn't he get rid of the evil?
Mm-hmm.
You know, why is that almost equal to the power that God has?
Right. Why does God allow evil to even exist?
Yes.
That is the question of the ages.
We all struggle with that.
Mhm.
It's a real struggle. I mean, that's, you know.
Yeah. So one note I made, I made a note that said Lamentations, specifically even Lamentations chapter 3, it doesn't solve the problem of affliction or evil, but it does ask the listener to sit with it. It asks us to sit with what God apparently imposed upon the Israelite people. It asks us to grieve with them, to feel that affliction that they felt, that hurt, that lost, that sense of being lost that they felt. So again, if we glean anything from it, it's again about looking around at the world and being willing to suffer along with people. Maybe not physically in the way that they are, but if we know someone in chemotherapy, someone who has lost a loved one, someone who has lost finances, or whose marriage has dissolved, we are to find ways to feel that pain with them. Maybe not as acutely as they do, but to suffer along with them. And I think Lamentations in many ways is kind of a call to solidarity in suffering.
I think that sometimes, because I've been through all of the losses, that when people have a loss, I can empathize with them even more.
Right.
And I feel what they're going through.
Has that caused you, all that you've endured in life, Rachel, has that caused you to maybe be a little more compassionate, and when you know someone else is suffering in any way, do you find that you're more attentive to call on them or to pray for them?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Talking about perfection and why does God allow evil, there was a music commentator who was complaining about the use of auto-tune. Auto-tune is how you take a tape recorded performance, and if somebody misses their pitch, you can fix it.
You can
And
get them in tune.
you can get them in tune so they sound better. But he said some musical groups overuse it to the point where it starts to sound artificial and computer generated. And he said actually small errors in a performance make it sound more human and
Natural.
more real. So you need a little errors.
Yeah.
Not too much though.
Well, God made us to be human, and whether it was God in God's intent to allow evil into the world, I don't believe it was. God loves us even as a flawed humanity, I believe. So, and again, that goes back to He will have compassion according to the abundance of His steadfast love. So God is forgiving and compassionate, though we may have times of being humbled, though there may be times, seasons of life that we feel distant from God. That's not meant to be permanent. You know, God is always
sometimes
drawing
we
us
feel
back.
very dumb.
Well, I've always
Why
had
did I do that?
I've had a dilemma with prayers of intercession.
Yeah.
I never even heard of prayers of intercession
Okay.
until I was a freshman in college. I went to a church in New York City,
Okay.
and they started talking about prayers of intercession. What in the world are they talking about?
Right.
And so I began to read, and so basically, you're asking God to possibly change His mind about something.
Intercede. Yeah. Yeah. You're asking God to intercede in something that. But we do find that in the Bible, but in the Old Testament specifically, I think of the way that Abraham kept going, or Moses kept going back to God and reminding God of His promise of faithfulness to the Israelite people. It was almost as if Moses had to remind God of what God had said God would do, and but that's a dilemma for me biblically. So I don't know that I can solve that one today. But the example is there that God may alter what God had intended. I don't know.
There's Bible scholars say that we all know that the different gospels sometimes don't agree on facts. And some scholars in the first few hundred years of the church decided to come out with a gospel that fixed all that. They had one gospel and they'd agree on what the facts were, and then there would be no conflicts. But it never caught on.
Yeah.
And I must say that as I get older and exposed more to things going wrong, part of the thing, there's a certain comfort when the scriptures don't quite get things right.
Right. Yeah. It adds that human element
How
into
can they
it.
get them wrong?
Well, it's kind of like the auto-tune thing. If
Yeah.
you have different witnesses to an event, let's say a car accident happens out front, and you have four, let's go with the four gospels. You have four different people who go out, and they all kind of see this one car hit another. They're going to give, on the whole, they will give the same account of what happened. Car A
Similar.
hit car B, but there will be little details that don't line up because someone came out a little bit late, or someone had a different angle, and they saw car B slow down quickly, and then someone else saw car A swerve a little bit. But we can kind of get hung up on those details, I think, can't we?
But what about the rest of the scripture? I mean, the Old and New Testament. I mean, you wouldn't think that somebody wrote something that wasn't true, would you?
I don't think. I think our human limitation, our human knowledge of God and the ways that God interacted with the world, I think are very limited. And so one thing I find out about Lutheranism is Lutherans will say the Bible is inspired by God. I don't think we often go as far as saying it's an infallible book. More evangelical denominations, non-denominational denominations, tend to use the words inerrant and infallible when they talk about the Bible. I'm not comfortable, even as a pastor, with calling the Bible infallible and inerrant, because you can find contradictions in the Bible. I can't pull those off the top of my head, but I have them noted in some books of mine. You will find contradicting texts in one Old Testament book to the next. And it may be minor things as to an order of events. It may not be like, in one book it said David hit Goliath with a stone, and in one book it was Saul hit it. It's nothing like that, but it may be chronological things that contradict. So I don't like using the word infallible about the Bible. I believe it is God inspired, but dictated by flawed human hands. And so sometimes things don't line up as they ought to. I don't think that takes any holiness out of the book. I don't think that makes it less sacred or less God-breathed. If God in the Bible can take flawed people like David and Peter and Paul and even Abraham and Sarah, who kind of laughed at God, if God can use all of those people in very mighty, powerful ways because of their flaws, then I don't have any issue finding that maybe the dictating of the Bible maybe has some handprints of a flawed humanity on it too.
I also see it as a freedom of choice that God gave them, that I use these words or want you, you know, versus this word, and yet the general point is still the same.
Right. Yes, I would agree with that, Diane, that the message of God's love comes through consistently. God was faithful to Israelite people who were not faithful to God. God in Jesus was faithful to people who condemned him wrongly, unjustly, and said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. The arc of the Bible is God continually being upset with humanity, but never withdrawing God's hand from humanity. Always extending forgiveness and love and compassion. So I have no issue with a few, contradictions within the Bible.
Well, plus, every time it gets translated over and over, and this one translates, and this one translates, to take a word and make it into an English kind of thing may or may not be the same, depending on what their background is for language and all that. So.
Absolutely. I was reading here about Lamentations, and even the way they had to take some specific Hebrew words and translate them were really kind of difficult, because in Lamentations 3, before we begin the lectionary today, at the beginning of chapter 3, there is a Hebrew word called geber that meant strong man, who was expected to defend the city of Jerusalem, and he failed on his duty. But strong man, geber, strong man, might not even be a word that would make sense to us today. Does that mean a military officer? Does that mean a big, bulky, strong man? My point is to say that, when you have Hebrew and Greek text that has been translated thousands of times by different communities of people, you just, in a very human way, you cannot expect what the Bible is today to perfectly replicate its original flow and feel. But I think in a simplistic way, we do expect that. In a very human way, too. We think that what the word of the Bible is today, well, that's what it always has been. That's what it's meant to be. But if we just peel a layer back, I like to say, well, how could that be? Again, it doesn't take away from the heart of it. It doesn't take away from the holiness and the intent of it. But
that's also why the Lutherans tend to you did Lilo not literally,
Mm-hmm.
because if you took word for word, that's
Right.
where you get tripped up.
And there are plenty of books in the Bible. I think of Song of Solomon, parts of Genesis that were meant to be poetic. Maybe even parts of the book of, Job would be a good example. Was there literally this heavenly duel between God and the Satan for Job's life? Maybe, but it could have been more of a narrative moral lesson that was told to a people to kind of explain this, why do people suffer, as we've talked about. I mean, the whole point of Lamentations, the whole point of what we've been discussing is kind of why does God let suffering happen? Well, you could look at a book like Job as kind of a moral story at the time that helped people kind of get some insight, as to why suffering happened and what hand God may have played in that. It may have not been a literal man named Job. It may have, but it may have not been a literal man named Job who lost his family and his house, and it may have been more of a fictional account meant to kind of teach a moral lesson. So, I don't know. I'm just giving one.
It teaches us faithfulness.
Mm-hmm. Job and Lamentations are meant to teach us faithfulness.
Also basically tells me that God will restore me and not abandon me no matter what. Hold on to the hope.
That would be the main takeaway that I would take away too. Yeah. Because of time, and because 2 Corinthians does not tie explicitly into this theme of finding hope in the middle of suffering, I would like to ask that we go on to the gospel. Would that be okay with you all?
Sure.
Okay.
You want me to read?
I would love that, Marcia. Mark 5.
Okay, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately where the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned from the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear, and trembling fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, and went to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up, began to walk about. she was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat.
Thank you.
I was looking for the next page.
That's all right. Thank you, Marcia. Well, again, I think we all should be able to relate to kind of the question being asked in between the lines. Will I be healed? Will my loved one be healed? What do we think about this gospel text?
It leaves the question of if I have enough faith, you know, and sometimes you have to look at that faith in different ways and how God answers.
But it's like saying if you pray hard enough, God will hear you and make it the way you want it to be. But I don't think that has anything to do with it. I had a friend who was a medical doctor, and his sister was a physical therapist. Their father was a Christian Scientist. Now, well into his 50s or 60s, he was having a heart issue, and my friend, who was an internist, prescribed a medication for him. And his dad very reluctantly took it. He didn't get any better. And finally Tom said to him, "Dad, if you think that this is not helping you, then quit." And he did. He quit and he was fine after that. But he was so convinced that his faith and the heart problem were so interconnected, and he just could not abide taking this medication, and it worked out okay. I mean, he survived and he did a good job after that. But
But that question of why do some people find healing and
some others not.
Others do not, that will linger with us always.
Yep.
I think so. We can talk about that, and we can be honest with God at this table about those unanswerables.
Well, I think it's possible to get angry with God and say, "This isn't fair. I've been a faithful person, and why are you doing this to me?"
And I think you would find that same kind of lament in the Psalms. So you're in good company. Yeah.
I have a lot of faith issues, and as I'm getting older, I'm not sure that it's any easier.
I don't think it's meant to be.
Oh.
I think that...
I want to be calm and
well, so related to that, where I'm thinking I'm going to take my sermon on Sunday is I read in one of my commentaries about a man who had been diagnosed with an illness, a terminal illness, and he had prayed for healing. He had people pray for him for healing. No, it was the commentator. It was a friend who had Parkinson's disease, and he had lived with this and become more and more debilitated by it for decades. And I think, and the man who had Parkinson's said something to the effect of he felt that his prayers had been answered. And the friend said, "But you haven't been healed of Parkinson's." And he said something to the effect of, "I've been, but I'm okay with it now."
Exactly.
So the point is, sometimes to be healed could be to be healed of the fear of the ailment or the illness. And that's where I might focus this Sunday, is I think we live in finite bodies, right? We live in a finite, flawed, fragile world that from the beginning of time, well, from the fall of humanity anyway, from the fall in the garden, we have had disease, we have had evil, we have had, a strained relationship with God. So we have had all these limits on us that maybe God didn't intend from the beginning, but as long as, the Bible will take us back to, we've had finiteness, illness, disease, suffering, pain. And I think to expect God to take something that was not meant to be, meaning we live in these bodies that will continue to age and break down, to expect God to undo that seems to be asking something that I don't even know that we ought to ask God for. Not that we shouldn't ask for people to be healed. I don't mean to imply that. But could healing be asking God to take away the fear of aging, the fear of loss, the fear of death? That could be a healing too.
Well, it wouldn't hurt to not have all these, right, just take away the lines, take away the...
Well, and we certainly thank God for the gift of the human mind and medicine, don't we? That allows us to live with pain and illness, and sometimes provide a healing of it. So we don't want to, we don't want to miss that ability to thank God for that too. But yeah, I think it gives us a lot to think about in how what we expect of God and what we pray for.
There was a lady on television the other day I was watching, and she lived with a lot of pain, and they couldn't find out why. And she came to her mind that she could sit at home and be in pain, or she could get up and go out and do what she needed to do. She'd still be in pain, but that would take her mind off of some of the pain. So she accepted it.
In this gospel, we find kind of two healing stories. They call it sandwiched together. You have the man Jairus, a leader of the synagogue, and he comes to Jesus knowing that his daughter is nearing death, or at the point of death. And then they begin that narrative, and then the gospel writer puts in this healing of a woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years, and then they follow up with Jesus then almost showing up late for the daughter who was near death, and then almost bringing her back to life. So what do we think of these healing narratives in the Gospel of Mark? We've heard them many, many times, but what do you all make of them? What do we think of them today?
Well, I think God heals in different ways, as you said. And sometimes we have to accept, but in this case, it was a matter that he said, don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
Do you think that those people were not going to tell everyone?
I know.
Why did he frequently do that? With his teachings and with his curing and stuff?
I don't know exactly. I would think that some people believe, and I think I lean into this belief too, that he didn't want to be seen as like a circus sideshow act. He wanted to be known more about. Okay, so for example, in these healing stories, it's not only that people became healed, but they became transformed too by faith in the Son of God. So the healing came not only physically, but in their ability to believe that God was there among them and cared about them. If his role on earth became all about fixing illness, like a magician, yeah, then I think he was bombarded anyway, right? But I think there was a danger in him being kind of tapped on to quickly fix any kind of illness, and I think he wanted to limit that. Even though he had that power, I think he wanted to limit his use of it. So again, that more times than not, the healing that would occur would be spiritual, and that a life would be made new instead of an ailment being fixed.
My initial
like a random
reaction
act.
was that,
A random act of healing, kind of, yeah.
I said my initial reaction was that I didn't see that, you know, his ministry was complete yet, and he needed to go out and
Right.
straight the more faith out there and
Yeah.
stuff. Plus, I read in my Bible, the study Bible, that he didn't want to riot at that time. There were so many thieves
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's true.
Yeah, and there likely would have been rioting. Well, we see with this unnamed woman in this gospel text about the crowds, you know, pressing in to the point that this woman could be, could bump into his cloak without even being known. And, you know, she was close enough that he didn't even know who had touched him, but he felt that power had left his body. And this woman then immediately felt that her hemorrhage had stopped. But the fact that, you know, the crowds were like so, you know, thick there, that yeah, if he began to heal anyone with any ailment, you know, like ding 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 ding, you know, it would have caused a riot. Yeah.
And it wouldn't necessarily have created faith either.
And it wouldn't have created. That's the perfect thing to take away from this, is it wouldn't have created faith. It wouldn't have helped people to believe in him as the Son of God, but as some miracle worker that, you know. And then again, I think that the deeper takeaway is not to be fixed of an ailment, but to be made new, or to find peace that God is with us in that suffering, with that ailment. And certainly, I don't think that God wants people to suffer, but I think it's a reality of life that he expects us to endure with his help, if that makes sense.
Yeah, he's walking with you through it all. I know, I'm sure you found too, during their trial times, that's when you really, it's like you can't do anything, and you trust God and your faith gets stronger to it.
Yeah, when all you can do is depend. Yeah, when all you can do is depend on God.
Yeah, you ask God to help you trust more, and to believe more, to walk closer with him when you're going through those trials. And you come to a realization that those who die couldn't be healed here.
Right.
And that with age, it's going to come. Just help me. You know, I think all of us as we age fear what we're going to have to go through before we get there. And I want to just die in my bed.
In order.
And not know it's coming. And not know it's coming.
So he does commend the faith of the people that he heals, right? Verse 34, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." She had kind of been healed at that point. He was only affirming the healing, but he was
publicly saying it.
And publicly saying, "Your faith made you well." I mean, he knows that his power had healed the woman of her bleeding, but he's acknowledging her faith played a role in that. I think what he's really trying to do, again, is transform a life, not an ailment, but he's trying to fix a spiritual issue, or, you know, within people too.
I think when he says that, it must have been some kind of a special feeling that he had, maybe loss of some power or something. When he says, "I felt that power."
Yeah. It says, immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him.
Yeah.
So that's kind of tough to fathom, right? You know, that sounds like Superman losing power. But we do, well, I mean, we believe that God had the power to heal. And apparently, only, well, and apparently only touching his cloak was able to even do that, but it was her faith that motivated that he complimented and he commended. And this was a woman, I want to point out some of the participle usage from 25 on. There was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages. She had endured much. She had spent all that she had. She had heard about Jesus. So they give kind of this, timeline of what she had been through. But then she now touches, in the immediate sense, present sense, touches his cloak and is immediately healed. And so I find that kind of interesting. They wanted to kind of paint an image of a woman who had endured a lot for a long time. And it wasn't simply the suffering from the hemorrhages. It was, she had been to many physicians. She had lost all her money seeking healing. So I found that unique. I don't know what the takeaway is, but I found that unique.
She would have been an outcast too in that society.
Yeah.
Because of
Uncleanliness. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we have Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. So a Jew, believing that the Son of God, the Messiah, was living among them. Many Jews did not accept that thought at the time of Jesus. But he came to Jesus believing that, if you put your hands on her, she'll be made well. And then again, he kind of gets interrupted by the woman touching his cloak. And then the daughter may have died. Maybe Jesus got to the house too late. And then he says to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Again, kind of pointing to faith, pointing to what's needed is not only a healing of a physical ailment, but a spiritual healing as well. And the child is not dead, but sleeping. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And then he tells him not to talk about it. Because I think he wanted lives to be transformed and not only illnesses. So, what else? Does anything else stand out to you all about this unusual gospel text?
Lot to think about.
It gives you more to be confused about than anything, doesn't it? It doesn't exactly leave us with maybe uplifting joy, but I think that goes back to Lamentations. I don't think that much of the Bible is meant to be as uplifting as maybe we've been taught to believe by things stitched into pillows and blankets and sold on Hallmark paraphernalia. I think much of the Bible is meant to be that suffering of humanity, and how do we seek God out and continue to have hope in the midst of all that pain and hopelessness.
I have a question about the Lamentations. It's formatted differently from the other texts.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it formatted differently?
I will have to get back to you on that one, I believe, Paul. I don't know. You mean the way it's broken out, sentence by sentence?
Yeah, it's broken out.
The Psalms do that too.
Yeah.
Now the Psalms, it's probably because it was meant to be sung.
Okay.
And so even, we know Psalm 23 very well. The Psalms, meaning songs, were often meant to be sung, accompanied by music, and so the way they dictate them, or the way they break the lines, is to make it singable. I don't know if that would apply to Lamentations, but I may have to look into that.
Okay, well.
Yeah, but that's something good to notice. We'll have to look that up.
It was written apparently at a time when people were having a very rough time
Right.
on the whole. And maybe it was poetic or something, which might have been intended to be more helpful.
Maybe it's meant as a dirge instead of a psalm.
It could be. It could be.
Yeah.
I think I said last week, and I'll say it again, I think it could be helpful whenever we feel a time of lost faith, of hurt, of abandonment by God, to write out your own psalm, to kind of look at the Psalms and maybe model it after a psalm, or even part of Lamentations, but to write out your own struggles with God, and to let that be kind of a lament prayer, knowing that God is big enough to take anything that we need to tell God, and loving enough to take anything that we need to yell at God. So I encourage you to, because life is not all roses and happy feelings, is it?
Oh, it's not?
It's not?
He gave us roses, but he put thorns on those roses. Yes, he did.
Yes, well, very well put. Very well put. Well,
I'm going to share a short story.
please.
If I can keep it short. I have a friend, a longtime friend, since high school. She's 80 years old. She found out recently she's going blind in one eye. She was adopted at the age of 4, so she doesn't know any of her medical history. But the doctor said it's called ischemic optic neuropathy, and she could go blind in her left eye. 4 years ago, or 3.5, I think it was, I don't know if it was 3 or 4 years ago in March, her husband died, and she depended on him greatly. And she lived in Columbus growing up, then her husband took a job in Virginia, and they moved to Virginia for a time, and now she's come back. And she now is one of my neighbors. That's really not important, except for the fact that, I'm really in touch with her on a regular basis. 2.5 years ago, or 3, she reconnected with somebody she dated in high school when she went to her class reunion. And they became very close to each other. He died this week. And she is so devastated because she found out just about a month ago about this blindness. And, I think she's a codependent person, so now she is, she depended on her husband all those years. Then her daughter kind of took over, and her daughter does lots of things for her, and she has 3 daughters, but they all live out of town and have their own lives, and she felt kind of alone here, even though she has many close friends. And now she's lost this other person in her life, and these readings have helped me to maybe try to help her a little. She's a Christian, but I think that her faith could be a lot deeper. She's been a person to question a lot, but I just thought about her this whole morning, I just can't get her out of my mind, especially with these Bible verses, because she really needs healing.
Right.
And her oldest daughter is here right now, but she has made arrangements for her to go to Wesley Glen, and Karen says, it's just going to be for a short time. But I think her daughter feels that she needs help, and her daughter doesn't want to move back here. she just moved to Kentucky. And so she, you know, and she does have a younger daughter here, but she's busy with her 2 young children and going through a divorce. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just, things just keep happening in her life. But I just like to ask if you all will keep her in your prayers, because she is so devastated. She doesn't know what to do, you know. She just...
I think it's very human to ask God why, and I think God wants us to ask God why. And after the Bible study, if you'd like any book recommendations on kind of that subject, I have a few that I could show you and recommend. But yeah, I think Lamentations is a good example of that need to sit quietly and wait upon God, and to question, and to lament, and to not expect an immediate answer, or even the answer that we want, and really to acknowledge that suffering is a part of life, as much as none of us want that to be. But we know that God suffered too, and that's kind of where I find solace, is that God's not sitting up on some kind of divine cloud separated from the suffering of humanity. God has suffered, God does suffer as we do.
Well, yeah, I think Queen Elizabeth not too long ago said, the grief is the price we pay for love. And I thought that was a really remarkable thing to say, but because if someone can die or suffer and there's no grief involved, what is their life meant? That's, oh well.
Yeah, I think there's a song I like. I don't need to give you the title of the artist, but one line of it says something like, a heart that's broke is a heart that's been loved. A heart that's broke is a heart that's been loved. So that's maybe a good metaphor to end on. So thank you all for dialogue.
Thank you.
This faithful conversation. And
isn't that a wonderful little thing? For $12 you can buy that in Walmart.